This video was made possible by our generous supporters on Patreon. Check out patreon.com/NWR for all the details. Alright, let me start this off with a disclaimer before any of you can even make it to the comment section. I like The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom a lot. I've talked about them extensively over the past several years, and I wrote the NWR review for Tears of the Kingdom and was very positive. I also like Halo Infinite a lot. While I don't generally have excuses to talk about Xbox games on my Nintendo website, anyone who follows me on social media or has listened to the NWR Connectivity podcast will know that I love that series and just sort of Xbox in general. Now, all that being said, all three of those games I've listed have flaws. But this is a Nintendo channel, so while I'd love to talk about how I'd improve on Halo Infinite, I'm just gonna talk about it in the context of Zelda for this video, but rest assured, that doesn't mean I think it's better than either of these Zelda games, merely that each have flaws in different areas. Got it? You're already down in the comment section, aren't you? Yeah, I kinda figured. Anyway, my name's John Reardon, you're watching NWR TV, and this is a game design rant about what open world Zelda could learn from open world Halo. Now, when Nintendo released Breath of the Wild in 2017, the rest of the industry took note. Breath of the Wild took the open-ended, non-linear storytelling of something like Skyrim and mixed it with survival aspects one might find in a game like Minecraft, Ark, or No Man's Sky. On top of this, it worked in elements of an immersive sim, where the environment itself could be used to solve problems in a multitude of ways. Breath of the Wild was a mechanically deep game that somehow managed to keep itself extremely accessible to new players. Half the people I know who love Breath of the Wild have otherwise no interest in one or more of the genres I mentioned. Its effects on the industry were felt pretty immediately in games like Immortals Fenyx Rising from Ubisoft, or you guessed it, Halo Infinite. Now in fairness, Halo Infinite went into pre-production a year or two before Breath of the Wild released. But Breath of the Wild would still wind up having a strong influence on the world design of Infinite. According to an interview from Bloomberg with several developers who worked on Halo Infinite, Breath of the Wild's world design was absolutely a strong influence, and the game world was initially even more Breath of the Wild-like than it would appear in the final game. A significant portion of this was cut in 2019, as development was focused to have the game ready for the launch of the Xbox Series X and S. While this cut-down ambition ultimately didn't allow the game to hit that target release date, it may have saved it from what I've always considered to be Zelda's biggest narrative and gameplay pitfall. In both Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, players are free to experience the world and progress through the narrative in any order they wish. As a result, every dungeon needs to be a plausible first dungeon for players to encounter, which means the difficulty curve between them is essentially non-existent. It also means that no major story reveals can be tied to these segments of the game because the story needs to be able to be told out of order, or occasionally skipped entirely. Instead, major plot points are relegated to flashbacks, entirely separated from the main game. Tears of the Kingdom improves on this somewhat by more aggressively hiding at least one game dungeon behind completion of several other previous dungeons, but ultimately the problem still remains. And as a result, players are stuck watching essentially the same story cutscene at the end of 4 different dungeons. Now, I'm not the first person to highlight this as one of the greatest weaknesses of these two Zelda games. The dungeons and story presentation, both of which were improved somewhat in Tears of the Kingdom, ultimately still fall short of the series' heights. And that's a shame, because puzzling your way through dungeons and getting lost in a rich narrative are two of my favorite elements of the series. You can make the argument that some loss of these more linear authored elements of Zelda are kinda necessary when converting to an open world formula. Much like you could argue that if Halo became open world, it wouldn't have that linear, heavily scripted level design anymore, and fans of that style of Halo would probably miss it. You could make that argument, except that isn't what happened. Since the very first entry, the Halo series has been known for its excellently crafted linear level structure. Many would consider the first Halo to be one of the games that sort of invented what we consider to be the modern first-person shooter. Before this, first-person shooters tended to lean much more into what we would today think of as immersive sims. The original Half-Life had a huge influence on this, moving shooters away from the maze-like games about finding colored keys that they had largely been since their inception. There were exceptions, of course, and I'm not saying that Halo completely invented the modern first-person shooter by any means. but it was a major player in that change of trends at the time. Moving Halo into an open world then could very easily risk the specific format that the series itself had a major hand in popularizing. So what did they do? They kept that format and wove it into an open world. When Halo Infinite starts, you play through 2 entirely linear, classic Halo missions before you ever catch a glimpse of its open world. From here, you're free to explore and do all of the classic open world stuff. Climb up a mountain, see something cool, and then go to that cool thing. It does a good job of finding a middle ground between Zelda's strategy of giving you a totally blank map and Ubisoft's strategy of putting way too many icons on it. In Halo Infinite, only select key activities are marked on your map, while most of the discoverable things in the environment are just left free to find on your own. Much like Zelda, a huge part of Infinite's gameplay loop is about giving you total freedom of movement built around getting on top of things and jumping off of them. The new grapple hook makes simply moving through the world an absolute joy. The world is full of stuff to do, enemies to fight, and all the things you would expect. But when it's time to actually progress the story, the game gives you a place to go for your next objective, and when you get there, it may take place in the open world, but just as often, you'll enter a separate, bespoke, linear level. Once you're in that level, you're playing classic Halo. And in these moments, the game knows exactly what to challenge you with, because even though the game is open world and allows you to explore, it presents specifically the critical story path in a linear order. And because much of these rely on environments that are separate from the open world, they can confidently fill them with narrative reveals and big story moments without having to worry about you accidentally running into them while exploring. Halo Infinite is able to represent a non-linear space while weaving a linear story and even linear levels through it. Now, having a linear main story in an open world is by no means unique to Halo Infinite. Plenty of games do that. What strikes me about Halo Infinite specifically in comparison to Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom is that I think there's a direct parallel between Halo's linear stages and Zelda's dungeons. Not because they play the same, obviously, but they both represent elements of the traditional design of each series that would seem counter to their modern sensibilities. Now, Halo Infinite was able to preserve this key element of its game design because it wove it directly into its open world. But in open world Zelda, dungeons feel like an afterthought that have to work in service of the world itself. But I don't think that needs to be the case. Let me give you some examples from some older Zelda games. In Ocarina of Time, you can technically get to the entrance of the Forest Temple pretty much right away at the start of the game. In fact, Link's required to do that as a child to learn Saria's song. At this point, Link can't actually access the Forest Temple itself because he doesn't have the hookshot. But a first-time player won't feel like this is forced linearity because they won't know the Forest Temple is there. Despite the game allowing you to go to a dungeon, your inability to enter it doesn't hamper the openness of the game if you don't know there's something there in the first place. Let's do another one. In Skyward Sword, arguably the most linear game in the series, you'll visit each area several times. Despite this, you'll likely never know there is another dungeon in that area until after you're ready to enter it, because the game doesn't come out and say, hey, you can't go there yet. Instead, it simply gives you no indication that there's something there for you to enter. Halo Infinite does much the same thing. While you can walk to an area that may eventually lead to a linear stage, you have no reason to suspect that linear stage is there until the game is ready for you to play it. The idea that Zelda needs to allow you to experience dungeons and story in any order simply by virtue of the world being open is a completely invented problem. It's particularly egregious in Tears of the Kingdom, where the entrance to every single dungeon is obscured, thus blocking them off from the player via narrative wouldn't feel like a gate, because the player wouldn't know they're there. It's like the pieces are already in place, but the game simply doesn't take advantage of it. As a result, the difficulty curve is virtually non-existent until the final battle, and the story is shallow and it's simply sort of told at Link, often repeatedly, rather than him actually experiencing it directly. The story and your adventure very rarely overlap. Once again, this is not to say that Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom are bad, while Halo Infinite is perfect, by any means. I think both these Zelda games are at worst like 9s or 9.5s out of 10. That's actually a higher score than I would give to Halo Infinite. Infinite has plenty of problems of its own, with its very indistinct world featuring just one environment, a focus on forming squads, but ultimately giving you little way to meaningfully make use of them, such as in those linear levels, and a multiplayer mode that has only in the last year or so really found its footing. It's an extremely flawed game, and yet, despite taking influence from Breath of the Wild, Halo Infinite managed to outshine it in the one area that's most often criticized in those two beloved Zelda games. To anyone who made it through this video before writing their comment, thank you, and I now release you into the comment section to probably still be upset with me. To anyone who didn't make it this far, well, you'll never know that the angry comments feed the algorithm just as well as the positive ones. But if you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing, give it a like, and please do leave a comment with your thoughts. Hopefully like constructive, interesting ones talking about this topic and not just yelling about how one thing is better than the other. Also, I own some PlayStation systems, too, if we want to get out ahead of that, because I mentioned liking Nintendo and Xbox, so I should probably say that, like, I also play those games. Let's just, you know, beat that before that shows up in the comments, probably too late. If you'd like to yell at me about this directly, you can follow me on most social media platforms using the handle on screen. And if you'd like to chat about this or anything else Nintendo related, you can join our Discord using the link in the description. Check out NintendoWorldReport.com for a whole lot more. Once again, my name's John Reardon, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time. This video was made possible by our generous supporters on Patreon. Did you know that Nintendo World Report is funded directly by fans like you? When you support Nintendo World Report on Patreon, you get immediate access to multiple exclusive podcasts every month, exclusive Discord channels, an early look at select content, and more, all for as little as $1 a month. Check out patreon.com/NWR for all the details.